the presentation to her.
Yes. Oh, thank you. So yeah, thank you very much for this invitation and to take part in the Women on the Move Network's fourth, right? Connect and Chat. So I'm Derlie. Currently I'm an associate professor in urban planning at the University of Melbourne. I'm also assistant in diversity and inclusion, um, originally from the Philippines. I grew up in one of the 7,107 islands in the Philippines. So I'm from the Eastern Visayas region. It's one of the islands. I think the population is around 250,000, but daytime population actually doubles that. And so my father comes from my grandfather is a fisherman, and then my grandfather from my father's side, but my grandfather from my mother's side, they're farmers. Both groups, I think, both groups or both family side, are have really instilled in us the importance of education, and so it is something that has been very valuable and very important. And I think that's the only, again, even for myself with my kids, I always say that this is the only wealth that I can give them, ensuring that they finish, education. Next slide, please. So as I begin, yeah, my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am zooming in this meeting today, and which for me would be the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I would also like to acknowledge all First Nations people who are here in this presentation with me today. I feel very honored, of course, to be invited in this conversation about gender equality, and I hope this session will inspire some, if not most of you, to support transportation as a career pathway for women and girls. And I hope you would, if for those who have families with girls, if you have what's this daughters, it would be great if you could, encourage and have them consider transportation as a pathway, as a career in the future. So in this presentation, I would like to share an overview of the situation, about a bit about our research findings, but more importantly, what I really want to talk about is how can inclusive planning and design help shape a more supportive, inclusive, and resilient urban futures, particularly for women and girls. Because I think gender is really important. It's very important. It's one strategy that we can support a more inclusive urban future. But in the end, the outcome that we really want as an outcome is to have more inclusive spaces, more inclusive public space, more inclusive policies, and of course, more inclusive communities. So again, next slide, please. So what is a community? I guess you're part of one. So we usually define a community as a group of people with diverse characteristics who are linked by social ties, people who share common perspectives and engage in joint geographical action in a similar geographical setting. As you can see from this definition that you have on the screen, I would like to highlight the word diverse characteristics, alluding to the different attributes and identities of community members. So, for example, I'm a migrant academic, I'm a migrant academic who's a mother as well. So, I have multiple identities, right? And in those different identities, I share some common perspectives with some groups and with the others. So that commonality provides that impetus to create or to become part of a socially organized community. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah. And before we move on to the challenge of the normate template, I'd like to also mention that as part of, so you can see from the earlier slide, I had this women in WITL. I forgot to mention, sorry. So yes, I'm part of the Women in Transport Leadership, and we are a group of mainly Asian and Australia-based academics. So our aim as a collective is to increase the profile and global presence of women leaders in transport, but also to strengthen women's voice to be able to advocate for their specific transportation needs. So there are more, I guess, aim and purpose of the group, but mainly these are the two things to, I guess, increase the profile of women leaders, and at the same time strengthen our voice in terms of how we can integrate the needs of women in transportation planning, management, etc. And one project that we have recently undertaken was the G-Talk, which I have presented in May, and it was, I guess, the pitch part of this pitch. And so GTalk represents gender transport assemblage of learning and knowledge. So the idea there is to build evidence on why we need to support female participation in transportation as leaders, but also to ensure that the voices are heard. And so this is our studies. So there are two things that we have done. One is building the database by pulling together a survey that we have conducted in 6 Asian cities, and it's focusing on what is the college students' transit safety experience in transit environments, while we also did interviews of women leaders. And hopefully what we would intend to get as an outcome from that activity is to really, I guess, have role models, that these are real women who have achieved, have become leaders in their own right, not because they're women, but because, they've worked hard to be in that position, and it's the story of their journey. So they're all, they're in YouTube. Their interviews are uploaded in YouTube. So it would be great if you could, access those. And women from Malaysia, from Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, of course. Okay, so going back to the slide. So our built environments offer opportunities for inclusion if we design more accessible public spaces and inclusive transport infrastructure, right? So the aim is, how can we make our public spaces through design inclusive, and our, of course, transport infrastructure. Yet this is not possible in most cases, because what we base our design on, when we design, we think about who is the user, right? And what happens is that this mythical persona is usually based on myth and hypothetical persona, rather than the authentic lived experience of individuals. So as what you see here, it's a normate template, and this is typically a 6 feet tall white male, able-bodied, with idealized proportion, as you can see, which obviously refers to a mythological being, but this is what we consider as normate template. So this is obviously giving us very unrealistic expectations. And I was just, so in my presentation earlier, in person presentation, there were 6 of us in the panel, and we had to sit on this high chair, right? And what was interesting was that I had to kind of step on one before I could actually sit on, because obviously I think the design wasn't really meant for, for a 5-foot person such as me, but rather, an Australian male, 5'6", 5'7", 5'8", or maybe 6-footer. So I just, it was just funny how, that design of the chair actually took, I had to actually jump on it, like jump on one step and then sit down, rather than, slid gracefully into it. So it's the same with transportation. So when we design transport, transport infrastructure, we always have this, normate template of a white male, able-bodied. And I think they've realized that even for crash test dummies, that it's not really appropriate, because the way that they've designed it would actually have fatal impact on women. That's why they have to redesign the what's this, the when you get to crash, and then the bag that would come out. So they had to redesign it to ensure that they're considering the Asian physique versus the the male Caucasian physique, but also women versus male physique. So yeah. And of course, nobody's are created in the same manner, but we agree that even if how different we are, we have a right to access opportunities. That's why our transportation is really a public good. And because it is a public good, it has to listen to the different and diverse voices and needs and requirements of the different users, right? Okay, next slide, please. So, as earlier mentioned, we know that our citizen communities are composed of individuals who possess multiple and diverse identities. And these identities may be formed because of our race, gender identity, sexuality, sexual orientation, poverty, class, socioeconomic status, among others. So, for example, in Australia, race is also something that's quite, prominent. Um, so, for example, I myself, I'm Filipino and Australian, female academic, but I'm also a mother, sister, daughter, and Roman Catholic. And I also am an international academic of color. I'm referred to here. Well, actually, they refer to me as culturally and linguistically diverse academic. They don't want to use the, people of color. I think there's that connotation that's it's a very North American term. Anyway, so going back to the concept of intersectionality, so I therefore experience different levels of privilege because of that multiple identities. So I'm privileged because I'm an academic. I have learned, and I have studied, but also I am disadvantaged sometimes because of my race. Looking at me, you'd know that I'm from Asia, and sometimes because of that, I get, either microaggression in the workplace or, racism when using public transport, for instance, particularly during COVID. I mean, I didn't experience it myself, but there were a huge increase in racism because of COVID. So, yeah, so in that sense, we experience different levels of privilege as well as exclusion, vulnerability because of these multiple identities. So, Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 introduced the concept of intersectionality to understand the intersecting modes of discrimination because of who we are, of our multiple identities. She argues that these vulnerabilities or impacts become more pronounced when we consider the intersecting drivers of marginalization and exclusion. So, as planners, policymakers, transport engineers, and researchers, we must consider this multiple disadvantage when planning for inclusive societies. Right. Next slide, please. And so if we don't actually consider this difference in experience, so if I had the PowerPoint presentation, this is actually a video. So that's why it doesn't make sense now, but the left side is actually a male person coming into and picking one of the bicycles and using it and going. On the other hand, on the right side, it's a mother who has disability and caring for a child, so a young child. Um, and I just added a dimension that lives in a place that lacks public transport access, right? So looking at these two different individuals, when we're planning for transport, we consider them as homogeneous, right? So two individuals as probably users of public transport, but in reality, they do experience transport differently because of the identities that they personify or that they have. So I think it's really important that we kind of understand this I guess unique lived experience and how it affects and impacts their experience, but also how we design and plan for transportation. Okay, so next slide, please. So one way of defining inclusive societies based on the Copenhagen World Summit for Social Development definition, which is about value and embrace. So sustainable, inclusive cities and communities that are those that value and embrace diversity across race, gender, class, ability, generation, geography, ensuring the rights, geography, ensuring the rights and freedom of all people upheld, and ensuring that the needs of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups are responded to and safeguarded. And this, women as a user of transport is actually disadvantaged in some form and shape. That's why we need this network. We need these groups to actually have that collective voice to then advocate for change, right? And yeah, so next slide, please. So there are three ways on how we can achieve inclusive cities and communities. So one is social inclusion, spatial inclusion, and economic inclusion. So I'll just provide some examples, and maybe we can discuss more about this later on. So next slide, please. So when we talk about social inclusion, it's it's sorry, in special inclusion, it's really about providing basic needs, housing, water, sanitation, and access to essential infrastructure and services, particularly for disadvantaged households. And transport is one way that could, transport is a derived demand. So through transport, we can then access, these opportunities. Okay. So what you can see is one of my studies that I have undertaken. So it's so in this study we consider public transport. Usually we consider so not in this study, but we usually, how we plan for transportation is we consider public transport as a homogeneous space. But we argue in this study that it's not. So we are saying that spatially public transport is comprised of three types of environment. That's a walking environment, there's a waiting environment, and there's a riding environment. And the experience that a public transport commuter goes through in those three different environments is not homogeneous at all. And through our study, we were able to demonstrate that there is increasing sexual violence and harassment that are experienced by women and those who identify as female, as women. So, for example, members of the LGBTQIA plus as well, across these three special environments actually differ, right? So, for example, and so for example, in one of these spaces, sorry, I don't have the data now, but for example, for in comparing male and female experience, we can see that males would experience more non-verbal harassment, sorry, non-verbal harassment, while female would experience more verbal harassment, and when they're riding, it's physical harassment. So when they're walking in a walking environment, when they're accessing that public transport stop, for example, women would experience more verbal harassment, while male would experience more non-verbal harassment. So you can see that in a specific environment, right, there is a difference in experience. And when we're talking about riding environment, again, male would experience non-verbal harassment, while female would experience physical harassment, right? So thinking about this when we are planning for transport, right, we need to really consider this lived experience and the type of negative experience that we experience across these three environments to be able to design a more gender inclusive public transport. And on the lower right, these are just some ways, strategies and tactics on how we can make our public transport more inclusive. So that was part of our study. So next slide, please. Yeah. So the second one was economic inclusion, right? So when we talk about economic inclusion, it's about job creation and giving urban residents the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of economic growth, because this is obviously vital to create a more thriving cities and communities, right? So in this picture, in this photo, this is one of the programs here in Australia. So we call it NDIS, National Disability. I forgot what I represents. Is yes, scheme. So the idea there is that it considers the different needs of different people with disability, and try to customize the response or the support based on that need. So a person who has a physical disability would have a different need from one who has a you know non-physical disability. And so a person would then come in to assess what kind of needs you might want to have, and then provide that support, right. So it's really about responding to the specific needs of individuals. So on what you can see here is on the right photo is 9-year-old Matilda in Melbourne's East. She was born with a rare genetic disease called tuberous sclerosis, which affects her mobility. But now, because of the NDIS scheme, she keeps up with her peers thanks to the running frame she got last year through the NDIS. So in a way, well, that wasn't last year, but in 2020, yeah, last year, yeah. So she was able to then be mobile because of that support. And now she's apparently part of a race running group in their suburb. and she can, she loves to run, and she can, I guess, participate in that opportunity because obviously she's still young. Next paragraph, please. And another, sorry, not paragraph. Next slide, please. So another way is updating the disability standards for accessible public transport. Again, understanding that there are diverse and different needs of those who use public transport, right? And, we can't just have one solution for everything and assume that it already responds to the needs. But it's actually thinking about who are our users of public transport, and thinking about both access paths, ramps for boarding, signage, ticket machines, allocated space, and how information is provided. You need to really be considering, those different needs and different components of an accessible public transport, and also the different types of individuals who would be using it. Yeah. So updating the disability standards. So next paragraph. Next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah. And lastly, I could provide some examples of social inclusion, but one of the things that could, I guess, could fall between with social and special inclusion. So going back to the definition again, so social inclusion is about developing that guarantees equal rights and participation of all. So it's usually, like, for example, enabling socialization of individuals is one way that we could think about of this, Livy's Place. So it's an inclusive playground in one of the suburbs here in Melbourne again. And so in this playground, they have provided some tactic so for children who, for them to experience and play that allows them to participate, not just, because sometimes it's when we think about individuals with disability, sometimes we assume that they are not able to utilize playgrounds, but this one was designed with them in mind, right? So an all-inclusive playground, and carefully designed to support children who have issues with sensory processing. That's why you can see there the different types of tactile ground, and it has different zones of areas as well, depending on the colors that you can see there. So there's also slides, swings, trampolines, sandpit, water play, and etc. So again, this is one example of where you can combine social, spatial, and economic inclusion. Okay, so next slide, please. So in summary, inclusive planning in cities and communities can support more inclusive, sustainable future. So I didn't really discuss about the social aspect of inclusion, but employing participatory approaches. For example, here in Melbourne, when we have plans and programs like transport plans or strategies or projects, we usually consult, and the consultation could either be through digital form, or sometimes it's through what else? Yeah, through sometimes it's through citizen jury. So citizen jury is how they allocate budgeting for specific projects. So typical or ordinary citizens would then be invited to be part of that citizen jury, and then they decide on how to allocate budgeting. And so it's co-creating what is important in a city in a way, and that contributes to more inclusive cities. And I've met some of them things that I've mentioned is about gender inclusive public transport. I haven't really mentioned a lot on placemaking, but that's an example because we have limited time. Some examples again is the 20-minute neighborhoods. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it's enabling while creating and shaping a place that could allow you to access everything you need within 20 minutes by walking and cycling. And of course, supportive policies that enhance access to social infrastructure, accessible public transport, inclusive public parks and playgrounds, particularly for those people like women and girls who are living with disability. And next slide, please. I think that's my last slide. So so I guess I'll pose this question back to you. What do you think is one thing that you think you could do in your own city and community to support inclusive planning and design and help shape more inclusive and resilient communities for women and girls. I guess it might be more helpful as well if you think of it from your own role, like, professional role. What do you think is one thing that, you can help support and build a more inclusive community? And I think that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Derlie. Quite a lot. Always so interesting to hear your presentations. I feel like
Thank you.
I learn something every time, and I'm sure the others have as well. Our chat has been pretty active with additional insights. So I think we'll post the question in the chat for now. And while you guys are thinking about that, I would like to invite you all to turn on your camera for a quick group photo. Great, let's just do this before we forget to do it later on. And yes, since I know that we need some time to think about this very important question.
I can see Keisha. Hi.
Keisha is in Velocity.
Are you in Germany?
I'm in Ljubljana now for
Oh.
Velocity. Long time.
Oo nga. Visit us here in Melbourne. Come on.
I might, because my colleague is there in road safety.
Let me know if you're around.
Yay!
I love it. People are really connecting.
Yes, reconnecting.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay. That was pretty loud. Sorry. Great. Okay, thank you. Who wants to? I mean, since your cameras are on, feel free to keep them on, especially if your bandwidth can handle it.
That's
Who
nice.
wants to go first? Yeah, like. So the question is now in the chat. What do you think is the one thing that you could do in your own city or community to support inclusive planning and design and help shape more inclusive and resilient communities for women and girls? I see people thinking, no pressure. But
No pressure.
yeah, no pressure. But
Thanks for sharing the book. Yeah, so I've read this, the Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, and that's where I got the information about the crash test dummies that I've shared with you earlier. And yes, thanks also for sharing this policy brief. I'd love to read this. Thank you. So this is policy brief, safe city for women and girls, actually Vietnam.
yeah,
That's
I
great.
think what's really interesting about the whole issue with the crash dummies is it's not even just, men and women. It's really, as you said earlier, the idea of normate is a 6 foot tall man. And like not a lot, even for men, not a lot of them are like 6 feet tall, right?
Yeah.
So it really affects a lot of people. And so I know our focus is really advancing and the needs of women and like making sure that our voices and needs are heard. But I more and more I feel like as we talk about making transport and making public spaces equal for women, it really becomes more equal for all. Like we're really just shifting the conversation away from this idealized version of an ideal man.
Yeah. And I think it's the discussion should be shifting towards recognizing the difference and not coming up with another
Right.
another template, but it's recognizing the difference and how we can then consider solutions or strategies that would recognize the difference, but also think about how do we come up with a compromise, I guess, that would allow I guess opportunities or access to opportunities, or allowing to everyone to engage in whatever they want to engage. And I think the idea of intersectionality is really important because that's where we can see multiple disadvantages And we are only as strong as our weakest link. If we cannot be providing for the weakest or those who are marginalized in transport, then definitely we are failing.
Right. Definitely agree. We have no answer yet for your question, but we have a question for you.
Okay, sure, go for it. Yeah.
Kristen, would you like to ask your question live?
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you very much, Derlie, for the presentation. It was good insight views, like also to broaden also my scope more. What you discussed in the Transport Week, but also what popped up several times, so also at the International Transport Forum Summit a few weeks ago, was the lack of data. So mostly like people are designing based on their knowledge and the data set is quite minimal, which is like people are going to work from 9 to 5 and going home. What would be your suggestion? How can we collect the relevant data to make the mobility systems in cities, for example, or suburbs more appropriate for this diversity of lives?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid question that I think it's very complicated to answer. I think when we are talking about data, yes, we need to collect it, but we can only collect as much as we can, and that's one dimension of it. So in collecting data, for instance, we have a very small budget, and so instead of going for example, so we consider our situated context, right? So in what context can I get data? And so that's why we focus on students, so college students transit safety. And I guess it's also driven by what's the purpose, right? So we now understand that, for example, students are the ones who are captive users of public transport, right? Because some of them are not old yet to drive, or they don't have access to cars, for instance. And these are really the group that we want to kind of ensure that we maintain and sustain that sustainable transport, right? So and also at the same time, because I was connecting with other university academics, researchers. So we thought that it would make sense to use the same tool across six cities, right? So in doing so, we kind of thought of what scope can we do given this funding, and so that's basically how we arrived at the data set that we have. But at the same time, it's also thinking about that, this is quantitative data, but more importantly is the richness of the lived experience. So I really am a big believer that you have to live that experience to be able to understand the issue, right? And I'm maybe some of you have met Sheila Napalang. And so when we were doing a study in Vietnam, so we were running this what's this a transport, so early career researcher transport researcher forum or something. But anyway, so I was a big believer that as transport planners of the future, all those attending the forum has to experience being vulnerable transport user. And so at 6 a.m. in the morning, the first activity that we did was ride a bicycle around Ho Chi Minh City. And Sheila would kill me for it. She basically had to get off when we were going up the bridge. Like, do we have insurance for this? And so, yeah, and I couldn't forget that, and she couldn't forget, that experience. And I think having that lived experience of really being fearful about being a vulnerable user of transport, I guess it changes your perspective, and really think about who is the marginalized. It's not about being not being able to bicycle or not being able to cycle, but it's about that feeling that when you're vulnerable, you will be fearful of your life, and think about being in that person's shoes. So I think so that data is not too difficult to get. I mean, it's a bit difficult, but it doesn't need huge money to actually support understanding the lived experience of individuals within a community, for instance. So I really would encourage you that when you're talking about data collection, you have to think about these multiple data sources, but also what's the purpose and in what context. Because I'm really a strong believer that you really have to understand the situated knowledge that you want to gather from the context where your public transport is and who are your target users. So I guess understanding those different variables and thinking about what then is feasible given these constraints, I guess, is really important when thinking about data. And one thing that I really want to reinforce as well is SDG number 11. Right, so SDG number 11 is about sustainable community cities and communities, and so they have target they have targets there in terms of how do we achieve SDG 11. So they have target 11 point something. I mean, I can't remember everything, but there are 3 data points that they are suggesting. And so I think public space per capita, women's safety, and I forgot the third one. So these are good starting point when we are talking about data collection, because if we decide to collect those data in our city or community, there is that opportunity to have to do a comparative research across different cities. Of course, it's limited to those who would participate in the voluntary local review of local governments. So so that's another point of that allowing you to come up with a data that you can then, I guess, compare to other cities and communities with the intent of learning from them or comparing experiences, I guess. Yeah. Hopefully that answered your question.
No, fully. And I'm thinking about like our next mission to Vietnam, if we kind of do the same exercise with the Ministry of Transport, like put them all on bicycles at 6 a.m.
Yeah. I think it was fun. So it was about for 2 hours. So I think 6 a.m. it was still safe. People felt, still safe. But then when it was 7, then buses, trucks were coming. Then that was, the challenge, because they would just go around and in every direction. Now on hindsight, I'm thinking of it about it. It was actually very unsafe. But I'm thinking that because we were adults. I mean, most of them were either finished with their PhD or finishing PhD, and of course, I've asked them to kind of sign something that would would be legally could be after us, but saying that you have to make sure that you are physically well, and and making sure that so I guess it helped them understand the issues and concerns of person who's cycling in a very high density what's this hyper mobile car centric society, not car centric but bus centric, so I think that's important bit, and I think all transport planners should really, when they're studying, should really feel that, like have that lived experience.
We
Thank you very
actually
much.
did something similar in Manila. Sorry, Kristen. Yeah. So we actually did something similar in Manila, but more for walking. So like in 2018 or 2019, I think we invited Walk 21 to come over, and then we did this walkability assessment. And since we had invited representatives from the ministries, not just of the Philippines, like across ASEAN. So we had to be quite careful about it. So our walkability assessment was done in one of the central business district. So like the newest business district that we have in the Philippines, like in Bonifacio Global City, right? So it's got sidewalks, it's got bike lanes, supposedly, it's like a grid network. And it was for locals, it's what we think of. It's one of the places we think of when we think of a walkable place. And what was highlighted by the walkability assessment was that it wasn't actually very walkable. Like you have ramps going from the sidewalk to cross the street, of course, but the ramps for some reason go into the middle of the intersection, in like straight, like diagonally, and you wait for like a minute and a half, then you get 15 seconds to cross a 6-lane road. So like all of these things started coming up. So I think it's really quite important to do all of these assessments with the planners, with the decision makers. And I know some people in this group are like part of working on active transport advocacy, like Mega, Keisha, Trang, and Anne, I think are working on that. So maybe that's something you can build into your next projects or your discussions with them. And I also see a question from Keisha. Sorry, do you want to read it or do you want me to read this for you?
No, it's not a question. I just
Okay.
There.
sorry. I
Study.
recently encountered in one of my classes Professor Paula Hiron. She is from Chile and she is doing a lot of work in this gender mobility and space also. And she's doing a lot of studies basically. And I just thought that it would be good to look into that and even like maybe try to connect with her. Maybe I'll email her. But yeah, she's doing the only thing is there's a language barrier. So a lot
I
of it
know
is in
Spanish.
Spanish. But it's so interesting when she presented it and like talking about mobility and like exactly what Dr. Derlie said, like when you're taking a public transport, it's not just about the mode, but it's about also getting there. It's about the waiting. And I think she did some studies on the waiting of women or something. So something to look at and like it's interesting because these experiences are like halfway across the world, but we just need to put it all together. And like this connect and chat is so useful. So thank you, Pat, and the rest of the team for putting it together. Anyway, there's no question. I just wanted to comment.
Oh, thanks, Keisha. Sorry, I didn't read that properly. Okay. We have a few minutes left. If you have any questions, feel free to turn on your camera, open your mic, or raise your hand now. Um, I do have one question while you guys think about your questions. So Doctor, oh, okay. Well, no, Sukma, go ahead, please. My question can wait.
I think
Sorry, we can't hear you.
you're muted, I think.
You hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
there. We could hear you now.
Thank you. Let me introduce myself. My name is Sukmala Rastiti. I'm from Indonesia. I'm working as a transport planner here, and currently I'm working for GIZ for urban transport project in Surakarta, Central Java. So I have a question. Is there any studies about women mobilities or gender mobilities in transport, especially in Asia or maybe specifically in Southeast Asia, because gender issue in transport is currently quite new here, and well, we still in the States to tell the people about this, about Casey and what is gender in transport, maybe something like that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there are several studies. They're quite dated, I think. So there is the East paper done, I forgot the author, but it was done in 2005, looking at ASEAN, so Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, and looking at the different travel behaviors of men and women. And what was interesting is that how women would start their commuting time much earlier, and how, so I guess it's that difference in travel behavior. So that's a bit dated. That's 2005. That's one. I forgot the authors, but they're Japanese, and I think there's one Filipino author. There are also studies that have been conducted by in South Asia. So Uteng Priya, forgot. So she is a researcher in Europe, but I'm thinking she's from India, I think. She does a lot of research on this as well, gender, and more on gender mainstreaming and informality and transport. Yeah, so that's one of the studies. I do like reading her research, but because it's both practical but at the same time conceptual as well. Um, yeah, I mean, there are studies that was done not necessarily in Southeast Asia. So obviously, one of the, I guess, seminal work is by Robin Law in 1999, Gender and Mobility, I think. And then there is one by Susan Hanson, I think, in 2010. And then I think there is one in 2019 or 2020, because usually um, in the academe, what we say is that reviews around specific themes happen every decade. So every 10 years, there is that individual or researcher who would then update what's what's the state of research in this field. So yeah, so the last one in gender and transport was around 2018. I forgot who the author was. Yeah, so those, I guess those are the three that comes to mind. I mean, there are also researchers by Sandy Rosenblum in the US, and she's done a lot of travel behavior, but obviously it's very much US focused. Um, Madariaga in Spain has done a lot about mobility of care. And I think very important research as well, because it demonstrates that how we consider the trip purposes, the typical trip purpose that we have, does not actually capture what we do as women, as carers, for example. So that's why it's mobilities of care. So because it's always captured in, for example, trip to work, or for work purposes or for education, sometimes it doesn't count, it's not counted, because of the lack of recognition that it's a significant so what she was arguing was that you need to really recognize those activities, that carrying responsibilities, for instance. And when she actually mapped it out, it came out a significant proportion of the day of females, and which was not captured in our typical transport survey. So that was very interesting for me. Yeah, I mean, I mean, there are a few more. Yeah, but these are some, researchers that would be really helpful. I mean, I think one of my very good friend, and Keisha knows this, her as well, Dazzle. So she was writing a lot. I think she did start researching on gender and transport in the Philippines back in 2007, I think 2007, 2008, but not, I don't think she has recent research on in this space, but definitely she kind of started that movement back in the Philippines.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sukman. Thank you, Derlie. I know we're running low on time, but does anyone have any other pressing question? I mean, the conversation does not have to end here. We're in social media. We can organize another one of these conversations. Yeah, we can stay in touch. But for now, I was just thinking, Dr. Dilly, I hope you don't mind if we try to get a list of those studies that you mentioned. So
Yeah,
so that we can share them
I
as well
can.
with
Yeah, I can email you the bibliography,
Oh, lovely.
the
Thank you.
studies. Then yeah, and then you can share it with everyone else.
Yes, we will do that. Thank you. So thank you again, everyone. We will be posting highlights in our social media on Twitter and LinkedIn. I think we could also post the video online, right? If that's okay with everyone. And we will, of course, share the studies later on.
Yeah, will do.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having me as
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you. Bye bye.